I now call to order the Society's 2429th meeting in the 149th year since its founding on March 13th, 1871. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Fall Lecture Series produced by PSW Science. Because of COVID-19, the Society is bringing these lectures to you via Zoom from locations all around the globe, rather than from our usual home, the John Wesley Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. Tonight, we will hear about golden rice, a variety of rice nutritionally enhanced by genetic engineering, and the social and political issues surrounding its cultivation, which would save millions of lives every year from the ravages of vitamin A deficiencies. Our speaker tonight is Rob Bertram, Chief of Food Safety at the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm Larry Milstein, President and Program Chair of PSW Science, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C. PSW Science is a 501c3 nonprofit education and science organization whose mission is to provide a forum, exchange scientific ideas, further scientific understanding, and encourage scientific inquiry. This lecture is being recorded and will be posted to the PSW Science YouTube channel, where it will join over 145 other recordings of PSW Science lectures. We invite everyone to take a look and explore these presentations. And if you like what the Society is doing, we invite you to become a member, which you can do through the PSW Science website, www.pswscience.org. Membership is a foundation of the Society, and I exhort everyone with an interest in science to become a member. The Society is grateful for the sponsorship of the 2020-2021 lecture series by the Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University, and by a donor who was asked not to be named. We are grateful to and thank all of our sponsors. Before we turn to the lecture, it is the tradition of the site to welcome new members and read the minutes of the previous meeting and the summary of the previous meeting's lecture. So I am pleased to announce that Rob Bertram, tonight's speaker, has been elected to membership in the Society. We welcome him and hope you will enjoy his membership. Recording Secretary James Heelan will now read the minutes of the 2428th meeting and the lecture by Wendy Friedman. Her lecture, Is There a Crisis in Cosmology?, is available for everyone without charge on the PSW Science YouTube channel, the PSW Science Vimeo channel, and can be accessed directly from the PSW website, www.pswscience.org. James, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, everyone. On October 6th, 2020, by Zoom video conference broadcast on the PSW Science YouTube channel, President Larry Milstein called the 2428th meeting of the Society to order at 8:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. He announced the order of business and welcomed new members. The recording secretary then read the minutes of the previous meeting. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Wendy Friedman, Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Chicago. Her lecture was titled, Is There a Crisis in Cosmology? A New Debate Over the Value of the Hubble Constant. The lambda CDM model has emerged as the standard model of cosmology. The model accounts for an expanding universe, 6 times more dark matter than luminous matter, dark energy, and the cosmological constant. However, recent data on the current expansion rate of the universe, known as the Hubble constant, suggests the standard model may be inaccurate. The standard model is rooted in Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity. In 1929, contrary to general relativity's description of a static universe, Edwin Hubble confirmed the universe was expanding by measuring the apparent luminosity of Cepheid stars. Technological advances have allowed scientists to refine Hubble's initial calculations. With data from modern telescopes, scientists have applied the geometric parallax technique to Cepheid data to determine the distances of nearby galaxies. The distances of more distant galaxies are calculated using data from type 1a supernovae. In 2001, Friedman and her colleagues calculated the Hubble constant to be 72 kilometers per second per megaparsec, with an accuracy of 10%. Friedman said that value has remained stable. Dark matter comprises most of the matter of the universe. General relativity predicted dark matter, and galaxy kinematics, gravitational lensing, and measurements of X-ray gas indicate there is 6 times more dark matter in the universe than luminous matter. Friedman said the best current ideas from particle physics suggest that dark matter is a relic particle left over from the Big Bang, which interacts only weakly via gravity alone with ordinary matter. The first evidence of an accelerating universe arose from measuring the distances between supernovae, and it continues to accumulate. Acceleration requires the existence of a repulsive form of gravity, now known as dark energy. General relativity allows for a pressure term and dark energy. The ratio of this quantity is Einstein's cosmological constant. Friedman said there's much to learn about dark energy, and NASA's W-FIRST satellite will seek to determine whether the constant evolves with time. The lambda CDM model approximates the universe's 70% dark energy, 25% dark matter of unknown origin, 4% ordinary dark matter, and very little in anything else. Friedman said the model is remarkably successful because its explanation of structural growth in the universe has been well supported by observational data. But there may be a crack in the standard model, as tension has recently arisen in the Hubble constant. Calculated from cosmic microwave background measurements, the Hubble constant is approximately 67.4 kilometers per second per megaparsec. But recent Cepheid measurements result in a Hubble constant of 74 kilometers per second per megaparsec. The error bars for these calculations do not overlap. Friedman said it is possible there is error in one or both measurements. But it is also possible both measurements are correct and that something is missing from the standard model, causing the differing results. Some scientists have proposed potentially new physics, including the existence of another relativistic species, for example, an additional neutrino or other dark radiation, a different equation of state for dark energy, a decaying relic massive dark matter particle, non-zero spatial curvature, and additional pre-recombination early universe physics. Friedman predicted new measurements based on data independent from the CMB and from Cepheids may resolve the existing Hubble constant tension. To produce new measurements, she and her colleagues used the Advanced Camera for Surveys on the Hubble Space Telescope to observe red giant branch stars, and land-based telescopes to measure the light curves of supernovae. The resulting measurements, known as TRGB, indicate a Hubble constant of 69 kilometers per second per megaparsec, thus not resolving the tension between the CMB and Cepheid determinations. Friedman is now working to explain the discrepancy. She anticipates forthcoming data from the Gaia Space Telescope will refine the TRGB measurements. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker, made the usual housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the society. At 10:46 p.m., President Milstein adjourned the meeting. Temperature in Washington, D.C., 16 degrees Celsius. Weather, clear. The number of concurrent viewers on the Zoom and YouTube live streams, 127. And views on the PSW Science YouTube and Vimeo channels, 1,034. Respectfully submitted, James Heelan, Recording Secretary.
Thank you, James. The minutes will be posted to the website in due course. Please send any corrections or comments on the minutes to corresponding secretary, Robin Taylor, at correspondingsec@pswscience.org. We will now turn to tonight's lecture, Golden Rice. And it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Rob Bertram, joining us from the great state of Delaware. Rob is the chief scientist in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, where he leads USAID's evidence-based Feed the Future program to advance agricultural research and technology and its implementation. He coordinates the Bureau's research portfolio, including work at the U.S. University Feed the Future Innovation Labs and several international agricultural research centers. Previously, Rob served as director of the Office of Agricultural Research and Policy in the Bureau for Food Safety. And prior to that, he guided USAID investments in agriculture and natural resources research. Before coming to USAID, he served with USDA's international programs, as well as overseas with the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. Rob studied international affairs at Georgetown University. He earned degrees in plant breeding and genetics at the University of California, Davis, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Maryland. All questions will be fielded after the lecture during the Q&A session. Rob, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Larry, and good evening, everyone. And I'm very honored and happily surprised to be joining you in the society. So thank you very much. That's really a great pleasure and surprise. Okay, so good evening again. As Larry said, the topic tonight is golden rice. It's a fascinating story that I think I'll be sharing with you, but it's one that I think is even more compelling with context. So I'm going to set the stage in a sense by saying a little bit about food security, hunger, malnutrition, how we invest in a development agency like USAID to address that, how the special role of nutrition plays as a global challenge and opportunity, and also, importantly, how science enters into all this, and especially biotechnology. So let's just start by introducing Feed the Future. This was launched 10 years ago by President Obama, along with G7 partners, part of a $22 billion commitment across the G7 in response to the food price shocks of 2007 and 2008. They were a wake-up call for the world when all of a sudden we saw prices skyrocketing for staple grains and terrible impacts in terms of people's economic and food security, but also the civil disruptions that ensued in a number of countries where people found that they couldn't afford things that they'd gotten very used to. So what do we do in Feed the Future? We help farmers produce more, we connect them to markets, trade, especially within regions, is important. Think of a continent like Africa with so many small countries. The domestic markets are just too constrained, and you need regional balancing to make up for droughts or floods that affect one country, but perhaps not its neighbor. Policy is critical, especially transparency, predictability, to incentivize investment, especially from the private sector. And of course, very important, this that was an innovation with Feed the Future was to put nutrition front and center, to really put a human face on agriculture. And I welcomed this because I always felt that the real reason people the Congress and the American people wanted to invest in agriculture is because they did not want to see the specters of starving children and that we had seen so much of over the decades. So this is, and indeed we'll say a bit more about why agriculture is so effective in stopping that kind of terrible image. So we've had some good progress in commitment. Rates of hunger and poverty are, extreme poverty, I mean, are declining, not the kind of poverty we think of in the United States. Agriculture, nutrition linkages, as I mentioned, stunting rates. Child stunting is a marker for the chronic malnutrition. And this is when a child is small for height for age. And unfortunately, it's not just about physical development, it's about cognitive development. And in many parts of the world, including many of the poor areas where we work within countries, often agricultural zones, ironically, stunting rates can approach 40 and 50%. So this is really like taking away the future from someone, especially, I remember Jim Kim, the former president of the World Bank, saying that that kind of burden of stunting just won't cut it in a knowledge-based economy in the 21st century. So he said to finance ministers, you need to prioritize better nutrition for your populations at risk. We also saw the SDGs, and SDG 2, the Sustainable Development Goal 2, is on ending hunger, but it's also about malnutrition, smallholder farmer productivity, because these things are all very linked. Productivity drives incomes, drives the availability of affordable, nutritious foods, and also increased purchasing power to make that makes them affordable. And then in 2016, the initiative Feed the Future was codified in the Global Food Security Act, signed into law by President Obama, and then in 2018, reauthorized by President Trump for an additional 5 years. And this is this is a signal of the bipartisan support we have for ending hunger and things like child stunting and the extreme poverty that accompanies both of them. And this is all driven by accountability. We tried to take a page out of the PEPFAR book, the AIDS program I think you're all familiar with, President's Emergency Program on AIDS Relief, where they had very clear goals. You invest this much, you get that much. Now with antiretroviral drugs, that's fairly straightforward. It's a little more complicated in ending hunger, but we did it. And we've achieved those goals. We set goals of reducing by extreme poverty and child stunting by 20%, accelerating the rates of gains to reduce those. And we've achieved that almost everywhere. And these were within these zones we chose within countries, large areas, but with potential, but also with high burdens of both extreme poverty and child stunting. So having this kind of accountability in place where we measure at the population level, not at a project level, reduction in child stunting and reduction in extreme poverty is very compelling when you go up to talk to lawmakers on the Hill. So a little bit more on the progress we're making. You can see that the 20 years in the mid-90s to the mid part of the last decade, pretty much everywhere, good progress, less so in Africa, even more clear in the poverty reduction on the upper right graph, where you see Africa, the red line at the top, has really lagged the other regions of the world. So it still has high rates of income poverty, very extreme poverty. And then I wanted to keep this other map in view, which is micronutrient malnutrition, the hidden hunger as it's called. And what you see there is that it maps to the areas of the world, primarily sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And these are in fact the same areas where you see the high burden of stunting and you see the high levels of income poverty. So these are all wrapped up together. And basically that micronutrient deficiency hidden hunger index is a marker for inadequate diets. Now, using some more recent data from just the last decade or a little more, well, actually several decades, but it's up to date. You can see that reduction in extreme poverty continued to go very well. It slowed down in the last few years. I think probably we can say that that's got to do with the number of crises in the world and conflict. We've all seen how many refugees there are, the burden of internally displaced persons associated with conflicts, and sometimes droughts, but it's really shifted. It used to be droughts that were the big problem. Now it's conflict. And then COVID came along, and that's that rightmost bar where we anticipate actual, for the first time since 1998, large increases in people falling back into extreme poverty. So that's a bad signal. And why is this? It's COVID, of course, is affecting the whole world, but it does affect especially fresh fruits and vegetables markets, fish and meat, all the employment intensive chains that are often the way people make money and often the way they access really quality, nutritious food. Now we see a diverse nutritional status in different parts of the world, and I wanted to share this because it's critical that we often hear about global challenges, but we need to keep in mind that the challenges in Europe or the United States are not the same as the challenges in Malawi. So for example, you can see in the low-income countries, energy and micronutrient deficiency still remains high. People are not eating enough animal source foods. They're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. They can't afford them. They'd like to. And yet you hear in a country like ours where people want to reduce meat consumption for many reasons, health, climate, you name it. Well, that's okay perhaps, but that would be a terrible thing to try to project onto the developing world where it's these people desperately need it. Many people in Malawi have meat on Christmas, period. So it's a very different situation depending where you are, and you can see it's quite the reverse of the kind of situation we have in the United States and other wealthy countries. Now, here's a picture of it that shows the relative burden of child stunting, child wasting, which is often health related, sometimes crisis related. That's where child is literally way too thin. And then you see the rising rate of obesity. But the key point I wanted to share here was that Africa and Asia share by far the great burden, the large percentages, upwards of 90% in some cases, of the entire global burden for these markers for chronic food insecurity, or in the case of wasting, acute food insecurity or lack of health care. So in addition, we estimate that there are 2 billion people with micronutrient deficiencies. Also, you hear a lot about growing obesity, and that's not just in the rich countries. India has a huge problem. So you can have these things coexist. The good news is that the things we can do to improve micronutrient nutrition among the poor can also be positive contributors to a better quality diet for those who are eating too much fats and sugars. If we make fruits and vegetables and animal source foods and nutritious legumes and such more affordable and available, everybody can win. So why does it matter? So why am I spending so much time on this? Because malnutrition is linked to almost half of all child deaths. And one of the things we've achieved, I mentioned the 20% reduction in stunting and extreme poverty in our zones of influence, but we've also estimated that we've 3 million fewer stunted children in the world as a result of our programs. So we're very proud of this, because this really does set a young child on a completely different track. Those issues that I mentioned around cognition, they're generally thought of as irreversible. So if a child has a very rough first 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it's hard to recover from that, even if the diet improves. So a little bit on this hidden hunger. Diet is really key, and affordability is key. You know, maybe you've heard about the Eat Lancet diet. This is one that's kind of come out as this ideal climate and health combination that people might be better off eating if we are interested in reducing the burden of chronic disease and also reducing the climate change burden associated with some types of agricultural production. But the affordability of that kind of diet, it's still out of reach for billions of people. So it's cold comfort to tell people that, you know, they should eat this diet if it's far beyond their reach. And basically 2 billion people can't afford it. There was a recent paper from Tufts University, Will Masters and company up there that measured the actual cost of trying to buy that diet. Let's say you live in Malawi or Tanzania. So we have complementary strategies we use in the development community. We use fortification. I think the biggest win there is iodized salt. It's basically almost eliminated that problem in many parts of the world. And of course, we use it here in our own country. Supplementation in emergency situations is sometimes used, but that's very expensive and not really sustainable. It's more something, as I say, in a refugee camp, you might encounter that. The other big area for fortification is things like wheat flour or corn soy blend, which is one of the things that goes overseas in our food assistance. But biofortification, which golden rice is an example of that, is a whole different approach. And it's basically building the nutrition into the crop. So it's affordable and sustainable. And I'll say more about that as we go forward. Last point I wanted to make before we turn to look more closely at rice is there is another culprit in stunting and malnutrition, and that is the pernicious and pervasive lack of good sanitation and hygiene and good quality drinking water in much of the world still, many people. And what you see here is what happens when there's a constant onslaught of what we call environmental enteropathy. And it basically leads to a leaky gut. The gut is much less able to absorb nutrients, and it's much more porous and is just doesn't work the way it should. The villi are malformed, and you see it's a very different physiological condition. So that's, now the one point I would like to add though on this is that when a child gets a better diet, that can go a long way towards overcoming even poor sanitation and poor water quality. There's a terrific study called the Luna study from Ecuador that introduced 1 egg a day to children, so 6 months to 2 years, basically when they were slowing down on breastfeeding. That alone reduced stunting by over 50%, just the egg. And so that tells you that when the body has access to nutrients, it can do better to defend itself against infection, against onslaught from environmental contaminants. And we're going to hear more on that theme as we go forward. So staying with that idea of infection and the diet, I wanted to go back. I thought this audience in particular would enjoy a little trip back in time. This is 102 years ago. Dr. Eichmann, who was in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and he came up with some really important observations that basically shone a light on the fact that several micronutrients deficiencies can happen at once, and also that there's subclinical levels that can be serious. That was also a new finding, and that this, at the population level, this may be even larger than the acute burden suffered by someone with very severe nutritional deficiencies. And I got this slide from Keith West, the professor at Johns Hopkins, and my next slide has a picture of him. And I'm just going to fill this out. So this is, again, keeping on this ideal of connection between nutritional status and infection. And this is the work of Nevin Scrimshaw, Carl Taylor, and John Gordon, and Theodore Ingalls. And this was in the late 50s. And basically it showed the effect, especially of vitamin A, in helping reduce the burden of disease. And that's Keith, actually, in the upper left. He's just stepped down as director at of the nutrition program at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. He's the young man in the middle up in that upper left picture, a great pioneer in vitamin A research. And his research and that of Al Summers in the subsequent decades shone more light on the burden that vitamin A deficiency led to, for example, much greater fatality rates with measles, greater fatality rates with malaria, and even just straight child mortality was greatly reduced if vitamin A deficiency was eliminated. So it's really a fantastic story. And that whole, before some of that additional data came out, the data were showing that, how pervasive this kind of malnutrition was. And some of you might remember that in the energy crisis days, there was also a food crisis. Sometimes these crises come together, not in any small part because fertilizer prices are tied to energy prices and so forth. But Henry Kissinger at the first World Food Conference in 1974 made this pledge that within a decade, this would be over. We would have solved this problem. This was just a few years after the Manhattan Project landing, I'm sorry, not the Manhattan, the Apollo putting a man on the moon. And I think people were thinking big, which was a great thing. So you saw they launched a campaign on vitamin A blindness, as well as on iron deficiency anemia, which is also a pervasive disorder that I'll say a bit more about later. So, but the data drove this, which is a wonderful thing. It's great to see evidence and science lead to changes. So here's a little bit more on Al Summers' work in Indonesia, which showed how much the mortality per child was potentiated and increased by various levels of vitamin A deficiency. So you can see it's really very, very striking. And this led to a whole sort of a reconception of what it meant to fight hunger and improve nutrition, and the importance of not overlooking micronutrient status. And you can see that. And here is a more updated map. And unfortunately, Dr. Kissinger was wrong. We still have a pervasive vitamin A deficiency, as you can see, again, in those areas that I mentioned before, the geographies, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Similarly, we see that with night blindness rates in pregnant women. Another thing, really, look at Ethiopia. I mean, it's really very unbelievable that the burden would be that high. And as I say, this is just a marker for the fact that people don't eat, they don't have eggs, they can't afford it. We are so fortunate in the developed world. An egg costs about 1.5 times to 2 times what the same weight of grain costs here. It can be 22 times more expensive in a country like Niger to buy a chicken egg, if you can believe that. So basically, people don't eat them. And even if they produce them, they often sell them because they're so desperate for cash income. The full belly syndrome, the fact that if you're hungry, you really want to eat rice, you want to eat sorghum and millet and wheat, so you feel satiated, and even though that comes at a cost. And then then looking more recently to a rice eating culture, this is taking us into the details of golden rice. You can see that it has improved. This is among school children. It's gone from severe to moderate, primarily in the Philippines in the last 10 years. That's probably a marker for economic growth and income growth, and people are able to eat more fruits and vegetables, more fish, and other vitamin A rich foods, more poultry, more eggs. So this is, but it's still a high burden. And it's in both rural and urban areas, although in the Philippines, the rural areas do fare worse. And very markedly, you see the difference between the rich and poor here, where the rich are only have a risk of 5% or an incidence of 5% versus 28% for poorer people. This is generally true with undernutrition, chronic undernutrition. When we look at quintiles of income with child stunting, it's very marked in almost every country. If you're in the upper quintiles, you're in pretty good shape. But when you get down to that lowest quintile, especially, the rates of stunting get up in the 30 to 40% range, which is really intolerable and unacceptable. But it's insidious. That's one of the things about stunting that's hard to communicate. People, they're just short. So they don't, it's not like seeing a starving child, right? Where you say, oh my God, we've got that child, and that child is in risk of death if something isn't done quickly. A stunting child has a much higher death rate, but it's much more insidious. It's going to be from some secondary infections where their immune systems don't function at the same way. And then moving over to Bangladesh, both of these countries are going to figure prominently in our discussion of golden rice. What we see there is, again, pretty high rates of children with marginal vitamin A, and this is more recent data. But a distinction here is the urban rates in Bangladesh were quite high. I was shocked, though, to see that the tea garden workers, so these were employed people, these were not unemployed people, these were employed people, had such high rates of children with reduced vitamin A status. And some 25 to 35% could be deficient. So it's still a pervasive problem all these decades later from when it was first diagnosed as being such a serious scourge for people. So here's sort of the problem statement. As I said many times now, people can't afford a healthy diet. Rice is their go-to. They love it, and it makes you feel full. And it's available and affordable, but it's not high in micronutrients in particular, neither in protein, but especially micronutrients. And when people have large percentages of their diet made up from rice, they're very vulnerable to micronutrient deficiency, especially vitamin A, iron, and zinc. Those are the big three. Now, how do we approach this? Well, we talked about some of these before, but this list adds nutrition education and, of course, the emphasis on a diverse diet. Again, generally speaking, we find people want to consume good diets. They like animal source foods. They like vegetables. They're just not available. Breastfeeding is also critical, but I'm going to surprise you with something a little later on about breastfeeding. But that's another matter that's very, very important, again, because it's the only food a child gets, his mother's milk or her mother's milk. And of course, public health measures to help combat diseases. So now let's move into golden rice. This is an example of biofortification, and you're used to seeing white rice. And on the left, we see a beautiful golden rice, which I always think of South Asia, where people use saffron, and that is seen as a mark of class and distinction. So it's really beautiful to look at. And basically what happens in regular rice is that they're missing key enzymes. And the two that do the work, one is bacterial and one is from maize. And they lead to the production of 50-50 beta carotene and lycopene, which is not beta carotene, but it is still a positive phytochemical phytonutrient. And it's exactly the same as the beta carotene that's found in carrots and squash and mango and papaya. And also in green leafy vegetables, you've often heard how good those are for you, and they are high in vitamin A, despite the fact that you don't see the orange. So we've also done this in other crops, and I'm going to show you in maize, but the difference here, of course, was that we could not do this by breeding. We could not breed. Rice did not have genetic variability. So the only way to get at this vitamin A problem, and it was so pervasive in the rice eating areas of the world, was to go a biotechnological route. And some of you may remember this next, this Time magazine cover. That's Ingo Petrikis. He's a Swiss scientist. Actually, I think he's a German national, but he works in Switzerland. And he and another colleague, Peter Bayer, partnered in the 90s. And they basically created the first golden rice. It wasn't in a well-adapted background. And instead of using a maize gene, they used a daffodil gene. That was what Dr. Bayer's lab had handy. I think the key thing, this long timeline you see, is to say that although this is straight, if it were real, it would be a curvy and bumpy road. It's one thing to get to proof of concept. It's another thing to actually have a product. So the background makes a difference. The early days of work at the International Rice Research Institute faced great challenges with issues like multiple copies of the gene, backbone, that means DNA that's not related to the gene. All of these things that would be obstacles in getting deregulation and having the regulators approve it as a food. And then really very happily, and I remember this all very well because I served on something called the Humanitarian Board that was an advisory group to this effort over the years. And the Syngenta company came in at the end of the 2000s, and they used their formidable science capacity, and also they brought in the maize gene. And I think all of us thought that, you know, if you had to choose between a maize gene and a daffodil gene for rice, the maize was probably a good choice. So, and they also were able to clean up the backbone and really have a really good quality event, as we call it, the actual transgenic event. There's still a lot of issues around putting that into the right background. You have to compare events, you have to test them, you molecularly characterize them. So all of that takes time. Then as things progressed, other things happened. For example, you see the young people there, or I don't know how young they are, but anyway, they destroyed the plots where it was being grown in confined conditions in the Philippines. These were activists, anti. We could have a whole discussion on that, but there is a well-financed effort in the world to push back, I guess, on science in these contexts, especially transgenics. But even now with gene editing, you may have heard the European court decided it was going to classify gene-edited materials the same as transgenics, which is the European science community, I can assure you, is up in arms about this, and I suspect it will get reversed. The other thing that's ironic about it is that irradiated foods, where you basically use gamma rays to fry the DNA and then see what mutations you get, those are widely used worldwide, but especially in Europe, which was the center for that kind of what was called mutation breeding back in the 70s. So in Vienna, there was the International Atomic Energy Agency actually doing that work. In any case, as you can see then at the end of this timeline, the product was getting near completion and in food approvals, and we'll go on because I want to say a little bit more about how that worked. Also, just to say the testing that went on to determine the suitability, the yields, the adaptability, and you can see just in Bangladesh, 19 location years of data. These are all controlled field trials, and it was submitted for deregulation by the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute. This is an important point. This work is done by Bangladeshi and Philippine scientists, respectively. This is not, these are partners with countries, and they are demand-driven. The Bangladeshis wanted to do this, and they knew they had a major problem with vitamin A deficiency. So this is very much a partnership, and certainly not a push. It's really a recognition that the countries like ours that can afford to share science that can be life-saving, that we enjoy so readily here, the benefits of all the public and private investment in food and agriculture that is missing, or health for that matter, that's missing in most developing country settings. So, and then this was all done by putting the chosen events, the actual transformation, breeding it into local Bangladeshi varieties bred by the Bangladeshi Rice Research Institute. That's that BRRI that you see there. Another aspect of this beyond the testing, and I know you don't try to read this, it's just to give you a sense of the volume, the number of files and tests that have been made of all the different kinds of analyses, from nucleotide sequencing, all the expressions, the digestibility for food safety to make sure that the proteins are digested and not anything that could cause an allergic reaction. And then also checking any kind of potential toxicity, all sorts of tests you can see, really dozens. And of course, the dietary exposure estimates, how much it would actually mean. And of course, the agronomic characterization. This is in the Philippines, just as there was in Bangladesh. And the good news was, or excuse me, is that what we see when we look at the chemical content of golden rice versus non-golden rice, the purple, the control, it's exactly the same except for one thing, and that's the beta carotene. So there's no difference. This is not, there's not something that's come creeping along. There's been so much misinformation and characterization of, what was it Prince Philip used to say, Frankenfoods, and it's totally unfair. This is just a means of getting a life-saving nutrient into one of the most widely consumed foods in the world, consumed by the poor, especially. And then also, very, very important, we've mentioned the agronomic testing, but you're never going to make a big success with a crop like this if it has a yield drag. We call this yield drag when you bring in any kind of new genetic material. It doesn't have to be a transgene, but you do see it sometimes when you do use transgenes, that it affects the yield of and the agronomic performance of the line. So this is really also very, very encouraging. And the other piece that would be important here is it's very unlikely that there would be a price differential. In other words, I don't think that a farmer is going to be able to sell golden rice at a higher price. That doesn't seem likely. And I suspect that once it is in production, a lot of it will be going into areas where there are vulnerable people, maybe feeding lunch programs in rural schools, any number of areas where the incidence of vitamin A deficiency is quite high. Another important point that had to be proved here was efficacy. And there is, unfortunately, a half-life with beta carotene. You can't keep this on the shelf for years and expect it to have the same level, but it is very high for the first number of months. Excuse me, high enough to, high enough to make a significant reduction. And although, I mentioned earlier that some level of below severe malnutrition can be a problem, but your body's very good at sequestering vitamins for which it's deficient. So if you get a child up to 30, 40, 50% of RDA, if just from the rice, they're probably getting enough other foods that they're probably in the clear. So again, this isn't a silver bullet. It's part of a diet still, but it can make a huge difference about how far that diet goes to have that child grow and thrive. Now, on the approval process, here's just a few examples of what was approved in New Zealand and Australia. They approved this. In the Philippines, it's approved. It was approved in the United States and Canada as well, I believe. So this was just done, I think, to convince people and or reassure them that this is not some sort of frankenfood being foisted on people. It was indeed something that is safe and available, and you could sell it here once it's available, and perhaps we will see it. And then just looking ahead for golden rice, it's a little uncertain. The Philippines has final approval, so we're very excited about that. And that is the home country of the International Rice Research Institute as well, which did a lot of this work in partnership with PhilRice, the Philippine Rice Development Program. And so, but the varieties will have to go through trials, so it might be another couple years before it's actually being grown and harvested, which is a shame, but that's the way it works. Bangladesh, unfortunately, appeared. I was there last September at a regional biosafety workshop, and I met with both the Minister of the Environment and the Minister of Agriculture in that country. And unfortunately, the Minister of Environment is just holding it up. There's absolutely no environmental issues here. Gene flow is not an issue with rice, but I don't know. It's frustrating, but they seem to like all the attention. If I can put my own sort of interpretation on it, the not official interpretation. The other point that I would make is I understand the Minister of Agriculture, very fine gentleman, is concerned that somehow this could get mixed up with rice going for export, and then their rice would be rejected. Because it's a visible trade, I expect the chance of that would be very limited indeed, but he has expressed that concern. And so it appears to be stuck, I'm sorry to say. And we've had a great partnership with our mission, USAID, the Agency for International Development Mission in Dhaka, to develop this with the Bangladeshis and also with the Bangladeshi Rice Research Institute. So stepping back now again to the larger hidden hunger, taking a broader look at it, it's 2 or 3 billion people who can't get that diet, probably that they need 2 billion who are actually micronutrient deficient is the estimate. As I said earlier, COVID is not helping these things. It's making nutritious foods more expensive because they're harder to handle, because they're intense in terms of human contact. And the markets where they're sold have often been restricted, especially if they're sold alongside animal foods. So this is still very much a huge problem. And we talked about iron deficiency. And as you can see, this is so frustrating to see that it's still at 50% for women of reproductive age in India and 40% in Africa. And, you know, we talk in everything we do now, for good reason, we talk about empowering women. And if you care about nutrition outcomes, you want to see that happen, believe me. And I'll share something with you in a few minutes on that. But one of the things about empowering women would be to not have them be anemic. You know, this is that alone. And you might recall on the Kissinger slide, it talked about the burden of anemia affecting productivity. And it does. People don't have the energy that they need. And so there's a real economic issue here as well. It's not just about cognitive issues. It can actually be about just physical energy and vitality. So that's the other big scourge, really. And it's very contiguous with rice-consuming areas. Both of these deficiencies are. So here's a little bit of an overview. Remember I said rice, I said iron, zinc, and vitamin A are the big three. And you can see there, they have somewhat differing profiles in terms of their role. Vitamin A, especially important for the immune system. Zinc also for that, and iron energy levels in particular, with anemia really depressing those. And then you can see the stunting is actually linked to zinc deficiency, and you see the worst cases of vitamin A being the night blindness and high risk of infection, and also bad pregnancy outcome. And then also impaired cognition with anemia, fatigue, and impaired cognition. So it's really something, we need to have solutions for this. Now, biofortification, which is golden rice is an example of, is something that makes sense. First of all, the foods aren't novel. They're non-novel. In the case of golden rice, yes, they are, because it's a different color. But generally speaking, you can't see a difference. People know what it is. So there's not a lot of behavior change needed, which makes it easier to gain acceptance. In some cases, though, it's actually flipped around. Orange flesh sweet potatoes, for example, which have been bred to be less sweet with much higher dry matter, the way Africans like them. And they've really caught on. And children, people didn't used to eat the orange ones. Children actually like the orange ones that are sweeter and watery, more watery. But the breeders that we have helped fund, and others, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK in particular, have been our main partners in these areas, are much higher in the beta carotene than the naturally occurring orange sweet potatoes, which are good. I mean, even sweet potatoes, the orange ones tend to have a high level of beta carotene. And the other thing that is important to talk about biofortified foods is that they're generally available to everyone in the household. We see big gender differentiations in some cultures, South Asia in particular, where girls and women eat last. So they don't get as much of the vegetables. They don't get as much of the dairy, eggs, meat, if there is some. And yet something like a rice or a pearl millet or other crop, everybody gets what they want because it's much more affordable. So that's another effective aspect, that availability. And of course, as I said before, this is sustainable. There's no recurrent cost. You build it in, it's mainstreamed into the crop. And the crop is used just like it always is for any number of purposes. Here's just a little bit of a review of an overview of what we have seen in terms of growing the evidence. USAID actually helped fund some of the early work in orange flesh sweet potato in South Africa that showed that girls in school had higher serum retinol levels if they had sweet potatoes frequently for lunch. The orange flesh, high beta carotene. But we can see that we've got an evidence base now with zinc, with iron, and with vitamin A. So that's really good news that it's being borne out in peer-reviewed papers. And then the other piece is that it's cost effective, I said, but it's also, because of its recurrent payoff, the initial investment goes a long way. And when you figure out the actual economic return in terms of health benefits, productivity benefits, you can really get into some big numbers. So this is why nutrition needs to be seen as an economic issue as well as a health issue. And it's just a very, very good way of improving health outcomes. The crops there's a program called Harvest Plus, which is funded by ourselves and the other donors I mentioned, plus some of the other Europeans, Canadians, and others. We've joined together to fund this kind of work. It makes a lot more sense than trying to each do it ourselves, right? And we've worked with these international agricultural research centers, and now known as CGIAR. It's the old donor group, acronym for the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. But you can see right across the board here, good progress has been made in a whole range of crops. And some of them are really reaching scale. So for example, the orange maize. That's the one in the back. It's 18 times richer in beta carotene than yellow maize and 180 times richer than white maize. Now, some of you who have spent time in Africa may know that Africans like white maize. It's beautiful. If you look at when they make their fufu, with the various nsima, I think was what it was called in Malawi, the maize porridge, like snow, and it looks very nice. But this orange maize is a big hit, and it's partly because it tastes good. The carotene gives it a good flavor. And I didn't get this for you, but I'll find a way to share it with Larry. There is a professor who worked on this at Purdue University named Torbert Rocheford, and he actually sells polenta you can get it at Amazon with the orange, made from the orange maize. So there's something you can all try when you're feeling adventurous and you want to have a tasty but also very nutritious addition to your dinner table. Then in terms of getting that scale that I mentioned, you can see that it's going up each year. That's about something in the neighborhood of a 10% increase each year in terms of expansion. And we're talking, going on 10 million households soon, and that'll be also reaching close to 50 million people. So it's really taking off. Once it's there, it's there. It's in the seed system, or if farmers save the seed, it's there. And this could be high iron beans. It can be a whole range of crops, high iron, pearl millet, and others. So just reviewing a little bit, we've talked about fortification and supplementation, expensive, high recurrent cost, effective, fortification in particular. It's widespread in our country. When you buy flour or you buy cereal, chances are it's got all kinds of vitamins in it. Diet is, of course, the gold standard, that if we eat a good diet and diverse, we won't need any of these things. But you see that rice field behind them, that's the biofortified golden rice. And I like to think of that as a sort of a safety net, because for the people who don't have access to fortified foods, aren't getting supplements, that's most people by far, rural people, they may not be buying processed foods, so no fortification. So those people are the ones that can really stand to benefit by biofortifying the crops that they eat and grow and purchase in the market. It's a really and one other thing I wanted to mention. You see the small picture on the right? That's a child breastfeeding, which is also a very, very important part of the message, as I said earlier. But there's another aspect of that that is, I think, surprising. What we find is that where people don't get at least 10 or 15% of their calories from animal source foods, and you can see that big chunk of the world, especially if you thought about how many people live in those countries, those people are going to be B12 deficient. And the mother's breast milk will be B12 deficient. And it could be vitamin A deficient too. So breast milk, we like to think of it as the gold standard, but it actually depends on maternal nutrition also. And this is another reason why I always try to push back in international fora when people start talking about too many animal source foods and such. And I say, wait, it depends where you are. It depends who you are and what you eat. This is from Dr. Lindsay Allen. She's a fantastic leader in USDA out at UC Davis at the Western Child Nutrition Center. Now, there are some things, all those crops I showed you on the slide just now, those could be managed with through breeding. And we were, AID, 25 years ago, we were actually funding that screening of all the genetic diversity to look for genes that would confer higher content of rice, zinc, iron, vitamin A. Of course, in rice, there was no vitamin A diversity to work with. But you know what? There was no rice, there was not enough iron diversity either. So in those cases, if we want biofortified rice with vitamin A and with beta carotene as vitamin A and provitamin A, and iron to combat the high levels of anemia, we have to use genetic engineering. That's just the way it is. So in fact, we are developing a rice that has both And we're doing that in partnership with the Gates Foundation and the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. So it's very exciting. It would be fantastic, but it's still a little ways off, but we're getting there. And we do have the high iron content rice. With zinc, we were able to breed it. So that's why you saw that high zinc rice is already available in Bangladesh and several other countries. But you know, if we look beyond these nutritional traits, there's other things. I apologize that the title's not showing, but some challenges we face, especially in poor countries, there aren't solutions available from breeding. Sweet potato weevil, this terrible viral disease of brown streak, which has moved across Africa. We're working with the Danforth Center, the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, to work on resistance to that. But also fruit and shoot borers, both in cowpeas, which is black-eyed peas, the #1 legume, main source of protein for West Africans and some other parts of Africa. And then in the subcontinent in South Asia, eggplant shoot and fruit borer. An eggplant is the most important vegetable in South Asia, and it's highly, highly nutritious and highly preferred. So what we found is that we worked with Cornell University. Monsanto donated the gene, what we call a BT. It's a bacterial protein, Bacillus thuringiensis. It occurs in nature. When you go buy your organic vegetables, they've likely been sprayed with it because it's used everywhere as a safe organic pesticide. And we found that we were able to develop eggplant that could naturally resist the borers. Formerly, farmers were spraying up to 80 times a season. So think of the burden on non-target insects. Think of the burden on human health associated often with people that didn't really have the best equipment, everybody knows what PPE is now, personal protective equipment, very important when handling pesticides. They didn't have the food safety issues, the residues of pesticide, a big problem, and of course, causing devastating losses, even with all this spraying and such. So we developed, in partnership with Bangladesh Agricultural Research Institute, Cornell, some Indian companies were involved, Mahiko, the Maharashtra Hybrid Seed Company, which had a partnership with Monsanto at the time, to develop this insect-resistant eggplant. And you can see there, we've done studies on it now. It's been adopted by 30,000 farmers. They're making $400 more per year. They're using much less pesticide. The pesticides they do need to use are much less toxic. It's really just a great story. Consumers benefit because they get higher quality, safer food at a more affordable price. And this is very, very nutritious food, as I said. But that took courage. You know, we just talked about the situation with golden rice in Bangladesh being stuck. Well, there was a very formidable agriculture minister, Begum Matia Chowdhury, who I met on a number of occasions. And you can see that unlike next door in their big neighbor to the west, or north and east, I guess, they were not going to be deterred by what they perceived to be non-science-based arguments coming from actually non-interested groups that didn't really have a stake in this particularly. Various organizations, you would be familiar with the names. So in Bangladesh, they went ahead, they moved forward, the Bangladeshis did the work, and they released it, and the rest is history. And it's growing every year in terms of the number of farmers. And we think it's actually being grown more widely than just those being tracked because people want it so badly. You know, it just looks so good in the field and saves so much time, money, and pesticide for a farm family like the family here. And $400 is a huge difference in the life of that family. I think probably everybody realizes this. So courage. It's so funny, you know, there were points in the Green Revolution that were courageous where 2 Indians came to Mexico and went back with suitcases full of Green Revolution wheat seed to India. And there were very courageous ministers in India that said, we're not going to block this and put it through some 5-year testing. We're going to go ahead and grow it out. And the Green Revolution and the incredible saving of probably 1 billion lives. Many of you may remember when people thought South Asia was going to starve back in the say around 1970, the population bomb. So this is this shows you how formidable and formative science can be when it's teamed up, human ingenuity and human courage. Here's all the food safety decisions. On all the different aspects with biotech crops, all over 1,000. There's never been a differing opinion. They've always been, and look how many of those are in Europe, but they've always been deemed safe. So this is, that the safety arguments don't hold water, literally. And then I want to just close up here with giving you a little tour of USAID's work in this space. We are the only bilateral donor that really has the space to do this politically. Also scientifically, we have so much talent in science in this country, both in the public and private sectors. And we work with them and with partner countries. And you can see all the different products we're doing. We're doing insect-resistant maize that's also drought tolerant. Really exciting. A huge boon for Africa's farmers when they receive it. We're doing golden rice, climate resilient rice. We're doing late blight resistant potato, biggest food crop consumer of pesticide, in this case fungicide, in the world. And so this would be another huge environmental and economic boon and nutritional boon. Potato is actually a very nutritional food, and it's a nutritious food, and it's very highly desired by poor people in the developing world. Also insect-resistant cowpea in Malawi and in Nigeria and Burkina Faso. Also in Ghana. We have a whole range of virus-resistant cassava with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in several countries in Africa, and partnering with the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis. So we're very proud of this portfolio. We don't beat a loud drum about it. In fact, we work closely with USDA and the State Department, the state on diplomacy, USDA more on trade. But what we do is we respond to the demand of partner countries who want these technologies for their farmers. Their farmers want them, and that way they look at them differently and they own them. They're not, when we work with a private company, it becomes a public good that country can own. We don't fund companies to do something that's then their product. That's not the way we work. It's all about the company, the country partner accessing this and then using its own systems to make it available through the public and private seed sectors, for example. Here's just a sense of where these stand. The most advanced ones are BT eggplant, as you see, they're commercialization ready. Also the insect and drought tolerant maize. And the cowpea was just approved last year in Nigeria. So that's the first biotech food crop in Nigeria or West Africa. The cotton had been available in Burkina Faso at one point, but not a food crop until now. The eggplant was the first biotech food crop in South Asia. And then you can see the others are a little bit further back in the product development, R&D, proof of concept, et cetera, stages of stage-gated project development. Now, I want to just take a brief minute on fall armyworm. This is endemic to the Americas. About 4 years ago, it got to Africa, and now it's actually all the way to Australia. It can migrate 700 kilometers, and it's causing vast damage in Africa and Asia to maize and other crops. Farmers in the Philippines, Vietnam, South Africa, they're fine because they have access to BT maize. And you can see on that picture on the lower left, the BT maize on the right, the non-BT maize, and you can see the terrific damage that this does to the cob. And that maize will be likely infected with aflatoxin and other kinds of fungal toxins that are very detrimental to human health because those come in as secondary infections after the worm does its damage. So this is a case in point where not having science-based regulatory, evidence-based regulatory practices in place is really damaging the livelihoods, the welfare, the food safety of countries. And we're working very hard in partnership with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations to try to put the evidence out there so that people can see that there is a good solution that 98% of farmers in Brazil use, and similar 90% in the US, et cetera. And then finally, just to say that there's all these other traits that we can get traction on using biotechnology. So you can see some are diseases, some are nutrition, but very importantly, things like heat and drought tolerance, salt tolerance, water stress, really important things in a world facing climate change. And some modeling work done by Mark Rosegrant from the International Food Policy Research Institute, where he showed if we do take advantage of these technologies, what kind of benefits we can, when we model out to 2050, we will see 10 million fewer malnourished children. We will see 35 million fewer people at risk of hunger. So it's not a trifling subject when we hold science back, when we hold solutions away from people. And then last point, environment. This is what's happened in the world in the last, well, you can see, look at from 1960 on, you can see agricultural production has tripled. Population has doubled, maybe, well, yeah, somewhere in there, maybe close to tripling, but ag production is much steeper, which is a good thing. But look at the price coming down. So that is like a huge day after day, year after year stimulus for poor people in the developing world who spend most of their money on food. So this is why the Green Revolution transformed Asia, and it's transforming Africa now finally. But it's because not only benefits farmers, the much larger benefit is because people have food that's more affordable. The other big story there, that bottom line to show the cropping area. Look at the tremendous difference of how much more food we have in the world now compared to 1960, with only a slight increase in cropped area. This is really, really important. So if we're serious about saving tropical forests, about preserving fragile areas, wetlands, biodiversity, watersheds, we don't want to be growing rice up on the hillsides. We want to manage the good, resilient agricultural lands as best we can, and we should put every scientific tool on the table so that we can do that sustainably, that we can do that safely, and we can do it in a way that gives a good livelihood and a nutritious, affordable diet. You know, agricultural growth is the most effective at reducing poverty. A new study from the World Bank last year called Harvesting Prosperity. It's up to 4 times more effective, especially in poor countries, and it's because it drives demand in these poor rural areas where hunger and extreme poverty and child stunting are concentrated. So it's a great story, and I'm delighted to have been able to share it with you, and I hope you can see how golden rice is one piece of it, but it's a signal for a much larger piece that has implications for all kinds of crops and all kinds of environmental outcomes and income and poverty and food safety outcomes across the developing world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Okay, so we have time for a Q&A session, and Zoom participants can raise their Zoom hand or type their question in the Q&A panel, and I will call on them in turn to unmute their mic and ask their question. And YouTube viewers, you can text your questions in the YouTube chat box, and all text questions will be read aloud for everyone to hear. So let's start with Dick Garwin.
I just wondered, as the beta carotene decays with months, does the color change correspondingly?
You know, I wish I could give you a precise answer on that. I'm not sure it does because they have done tests to determine it. I don't know if it, and I don't think that wasn't a colorimetric test. But you would assume that it might, but if it degraded to another carotene, it probably degrades to another carotene, so it mightn't change color. So I don't think it does actually when I think more about it, because I know they've had to actually do actual molecular testing,
Thank you.
of course.
Okay, we have another question from Frederica de Rima. Frederica?
Hi, Rob. First of all, hi, fellow Aggie. I'm also an alumna of UC Davis, although from the physics department, nuclear physics. But I did have a lot of graduate students that I interacted with from the food nutrition kind of departments. So actually, I asked a question, and when I asked it, you subsequently addressed some of the items, because I was asking, can you provide some examples? But also I said, with respect to applying CRISPR technology to create rice and other crops and plant foods, other micronutrients other than beta carotene, and also regarding resistant to climate and pests. So my question now is focused on the CRISPR technology application, if you can give us examples of that. And I know there's work done at UC Davis and Cornell. Also, you mentioned Cornell. So
Indeed, and we have just made a new grant. It's to Cornell is in the lead, and it includes Kansas State, Clemson. Probably forget somebody, and it's working with a number of developing country partners in Africa, Asia, and in Central America to develop modern approaches and tools for application in crops that have been under-researched, beyond rice, wheat, and maize, where there's been so much investment around the world. And that will include, I believe, gene editing. There's so much interest in it right now. And another really exciting aspect of that I was in a conference on recently is that it's going to open up a lot of opportunities to identify high-value alleles within genetic resource collections, because you'll be able to sort of identify them and then use the editing to actually use the sequence instead of the crossing, where you bring along all the DNA that might have all kinds of deleterious alleles. So it's going to make crop improvement, which used to be a numbers game, but no longer is. It's going to make it much more strategic. So yes, there's great excitement about this. And the other thing that I would add, Frederica, is it's a way to accelerate the rate with which you can do things. It used to be, you might have to, it might take years to do some breeding, but using molecular tools in general, and gene editing being one more of them, you can really accelerate this. And this, I think, opens up the opportunity to do more with some of the smaller crops, to do it strategically and rapidly, so that we can bring the benefits of science to fruits and vegetables, to a wide range of crops for which we could never stand up enormous breeding programs.
Thank you. Can I ask a one or two follow-up questions, or you want to rotate to others and then I can come back?
I'll rotate to some others and then we'll come back. Okay. How's that?
Okay.
I got a nice question from the web here, which I think I want to jump ahead of some people and get in now. Judy Lamanna from the live stream asks, what can the average person do to support this work?
Wow, that's a really great question. Well, sometimes I get annoyed. I mean, I go to Whole Foods like everybody else, or Giant, it doesn't matter. And you see that you're buying non-GMO olive oil, when in fact there is no GMO olive oil. So I think once in a while I try to let drop that this is a kind of a tongue-in-cheek answer, that there's not a lot, there's no there to all these concerns and fears, and that they do actually have implications for people, particularly in Africa, where they're so sensitive about not doing anything that could disrupt European markets. Beyond that, I think I think we all want to see science guide the way on many things in a challenged world, a world by climate change. I think these technologies, we talked about nutrition tonight more, but they're absolutely vital for pest and disease resistance in terms of being able to move rapidly and strategically. So I think just being open and perhaps vocal sometimes is something you can do. But it's a good question, and I have to tell you, I haven't actually had that question before, so I appreciate your asking it, and I will continue to think about it.
I would, if I may, say a few things on that score. I would say you should try to have facts at your hands that you can tell people. You can explain to them what the regulatory process has been. You can explain to them how these crops are made. You can compare how GMOs work and the precision with which GMO crops are made compared to the standard methods for plant breeding. There's a very good book by Nina Fedoroff, which if I remember the title right, is Mendel's Table. I hope I got that right, Nina. I know she's on. And,
oh, wonderful. I didn't know she was here.
It's a wonderful book. It's a very good discussion of these things. And you should read that, recommend it to your friends, and push back against these unfounded fears. We can't go through life being afraid of everything that's new and different. These are the things that lead the way forward to allow us to make a much better world, and one in which people are not going to be starving. And I think that's the other side of it is you have to emphasize that people are suffering because of the regulatory barriers to growing these crops in places in the world that are not like the US, where we can fret over whether or not we are eating free-range eggs, so-called organic, or we're eating eggs that are made in the old style. Most of the world doesn't have that luxury.
That is a high-class problem, as we call it.
Hey, Nina.
Hi.
Great to hear from you.
Hi, Rob. Haven't seen you for a long time.
I know, it's great to hear your voice. I don't see you, but it's just almost there. That's great.
That's okay. I was asking about the banana in Uganda, whether the biosafety regulation is still stuck on the president's desk.
It is. I'm sorry to say, I don't apologize, but I'm sorry to say that is still stuck. This is a bacterial wilt resistant banana. It's a terrible disease, and this is a very, very elegant gene from capsicum that confers very widespread durable resistance. It seems to be much more durable than we think of single gene resistance usually being. So that's another one. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Nina. I didn't go through all of them, but that's the one. And it's a pity too, because that's one that has really had the ownership of the Ugandans. They've been very proud. There's something called NARO, the National Agricultural Research Organization, just outside Kampala. And they're an outstanding group. Many African research organizations are fairly weak, shoestring budgets, but NARO has done quite well, as has, to some degree, Makerere University is nearby. It's kind of a powerhouse.
Well, I'm glad for the shout out for my book, but I also like to shout out for the film Food Evolution, because the Uganda story is beautifully described in that book, in that documentary.
Great.
Thanks for pointing that out to us. In particular me, because I'm not aware of the film, so.
Well, it's well worth watching. It's available on Hulu and YouTube and whatever.
Great, thank you.
Well, thanks.
You've seen it, haven't you, Rob?
I haven't actually, Nina. I'm embarrassed.
Oh my goodness, please do, because it's really that story of the wilt. I actually licensed the film so that I could use bits of it in my lectures.
Wow.
It's a beautiful film. Anyway, thanks for a great lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Good to hear from you. So let me go back to Tim Thomas, who's now texted his message. He asks, I'm wondering what the preference for polished white rice versus brown rice. I think he meant what is the preference? And also possibly a preference against golden rice because of the color.
It's a very good point. Sensory issues are not insignificant. I think this is where social marketing comes in. The health community is much better at doing that than we in the agriculture community are. With respect to brown rice, it doesn't really work in the tropics. It goes rancid so quickly. So they store rice as patty, in other words, still with the hull and everything, and then once it's milled, it has to be polished, because if left at tropical temperatures and humidities, it will go rancid very quickly. So it's not really a big item the way it is in the temperate zone, but even in the temperate zone, it's not a bad idea to keep it in the refrigerator.
Well, while we're on that topic, I'll sneak a question in. You mentioned that the maize, golden maize, is sweeter and appealing, even though it's a different color than the favored white maize. Does golden rice taste different?
I haven't heard that it does. I've not tasted it myself, but I have not heard that it does. The golden maize, orange maize, apparently has a very nice distinctive flavor that people like. So it's been an incentive to try something besides the beautiful white maize that people always appreciated before.
We have a question from Al Ehrlich, a PSW member. Al, can unmute and ask?
I was wondering if the nutritional bioavailability of the micronutrients of these modified foods are the same as the originals.
Glad to answer that. I'm glad you asked it. This was a big issue when this work was first starting. There were a lot of naysayers that felt that vitamin A would be not very highly bioavailable in rice. Interestingly, the exact opposite is true. The starchy matrix of the rice endosperm is actually very conducive to not binding up vitamin A. The place where it really gets bound up is things like spinach, where you really have to cook it. And even then, there's just a lot of other elements, things in there that are perhaps inhibiting its absorption, or bioavailability. But in rice, we've done studies on that, and it's very favorable. It's a really high rate of bioavailability.
We have a question from Carl Merrill, another PSW member. Carl?
Thank you. Hi, this is Carl Merrill. I'm a member. I wonder, when you're dealing with the administrators, whether they ever realize that all of our crops and all of our domestic animals are based on genetic engineering, using selective breeding. I faced that myself early because I did one of the first genetic engineering experiments. I put the galactose genes, cal transferase, from E. coli into human cells to correct genetic defect back in 1973. And in fact, soon after that, people realized that was going on in plants because we had a plasmid that was injecting a bacterial gene that caused the tumors in Agrobacter tumorifaciens. And I think that's been used in your genetic engineering. But the point is, it's not something new. Our whole society is based on that.
In fact, it does occur naturally, and there is probably some likelihood that Agrobacterium has, in the wild, managed to transfer some plasmids from one species to another. The other thing we see is outcrossing. Remember triticale, which still exists. It's a cicale rye and wheat cross, and basically it has there's an arm. There's a line of wheat, I believe, that has some triticale in it where it got mixed in. I can't remember all the details. It's been many years since I was in it, but we do see these things happen. And you're absolutely right. People have been selecting plants and, in a sense, modifying them for years. And wide crosses, wide crosses are readily accepted. One of the interesting traits I mentioned, late blight resistance in potato, and that's where people talk about we are using genes from a couple wild relatives that are not sexually compatible. So you have to use a transgenic approach, even though it's a solanum gene. Some people want to call that cisgenics. Scientifically, that's not really a valid assertion. It might be something that would be marketing might be interested in, but you know, there's nothing inherently different from using a solanum gene versus something further away in terms of the science of it. But it is, and this comes back to the gene editing question from Frederica, it is a way that we're going to be able to explore more genetic diversity. Some of you might remember Steve Tanksley's work where it shows the bottleneck of when crops were domesticated, and such a tiny piece of the diversity came through, right? There's so much out there still. And in a climate challenged world, if you can get at that without having to bring everything else along with it, there may be some really exciting opportunities emerge. The other thing that I could just mention here that's along this line that's really exciting, and it's not genetic engineering, there's a group in Minnesota that have domesticated an oat from another species of wild oats. It's from Morocco. I know the species, but anyway, it has much higher fat and protein content. It's it was remarkable compared to Avena sativa, and that's basically they just did this by accelerated selection, and they got past the shattering trait and this trait and that trait and the but now with these you can move things so much more rapidly now with markers and such.
Well, luckily there weren't any administrators early on, presumably, but we still have plants that we are, quote, domesticated that have toxins in them. And the only way we can eat them is by processing them correctly, like tapioca,
Absolutely.
for one example.
Correct. And the other thing people should bear in mind, and this is back to Frederica's question, is that no transgenic plant that is an allergen is going to get through regulatory. So kiwi fruits and celery, many people are allergic to. And that's one reason actually, that the industry's never wanted to go near groundnut, peanut, because of the issues around the allergenicity of that. You could do some elegant things there in terms of beta carotene and a fat bearing seed like that, oil rich seed. But so in a sense, the strict testing these crops go through makes them actually safer than what you would get just at a random selection of people with the food.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So while we're on the subject of kind of molecular genetics in a way, so I have a question about, I probably should have looked this up, but I'm going to ask it. Maybe you know the background here, but so you're not really, you don't, in order to make the beta carotene, you have to transfer genes in that can utilize the metabolites that are in the cell to produce the beta carotene that you want. So are those genes not present at all in rice? And you have to transfer them all in?
No.
Some that are there?
In fact,
if they are there, can you just pump them up by working the promoters and the enhancers instead of transferring a new gene in?
right. And this is what people are, I think, excited about back on the gene editing issue is that there may be an opportunity because many of the pathways are there. They're just silenced. The homologous genes are often there, but they're not operating. So when golden rice was made, the way to get around that was to bring in the phytoene synthase and one other, anyways, the one from the bacterial gene, and that allowed the rest of the pathway to work.
Okay.
They only had to do 2 genes in a multi-step pathway. The others clicked in once the substrate was there, but until that time, it was silenced. But now we have potentially the means to be, as you were saying, much more pinpointed and strategic in what we do where in the genome.
So I ask one related question. My understanding of BT is that we used to call it BT toxin, but probably a bad terminology. So the substance the BT produces that's in the BT is specific, pretty specific, as I recall. Like, you know, it'll kill one species of mosquito, but not another from a particular strain.
That's
So
right.
do we engineer for every single pest?
You know, I wish I could give you, I mean, there are pests where we have no BT options. Orthoptera, we don't have any. But there's many that are specific for Diptera or different, you know, various types of Lepidopterous pests. And you see differential responses to different BTs. So it's a matter of getting the right match. The other big thing, frankly, and this is a special concern in the developing world, is really to get stacked products. Because, you know, things like refugia management is not necessarily as strictly observed everywhere. There's a lot of knowledge content in these kinds, many kinds of you know, not just transgenic. So fruits and vegetables have a lot more knowledge content in them in terms of what you have to know to get a good product and the market sophistication and so forth. I'm very keen for us to have a further partnership on the eggplant to get a stacked gene in there that would confer a higher degree of certainty that this isn't going to break down. I mean, we've seen BT sprays break down, right? The diamondback moth, which is a huge pest, a Lepidopterous pest of many crops, polyphagious. So we've seen this can happen. So you do have to be cognizant of that. Having said that, all of us who have been in these debates often hear that that's a reason not to do it, but that's true about any kind of resistance.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing special about biotechnological approaches that differentiate them from other approaches. Insects and plants and weeds evolve around all kinds of things.
It's an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
We'll have a question from Bruce Murray, and then we'll go to Frederica again. So Bruce.
Hi, Rob. I was just wondering whether the golden rice would tend to spread out once it's planted and have some unexpected ecological tendencies.
Right, so adventitious presence, for example. No, generally not. Rice is pretty much entirely in crossing, and it's not considered to be a risk for gene flow, the way, for example, a genetically modified bean might be if we took it to Costa Rica or something like that, or a potato in Peru. So there's not, and then the other thing is that I don't think cultivated rice has a habit of being adventitious, you know, in terms of it doesn't shatter. If some seed grain does fall on the ground, I mean, it might sprout, but it's not invasive. It's not aggressive.
Thank you.
Yeah, so not 100% guarantee, but very unlikely.
Yeah.
We have a somewhat related question from the web. Brian Stevens asks, in the long run, is monocropping viable, especially when considering evolutionary changes and environmental pressures?
Well, it's, you know, monocropping can be done very sustainably, but you do need rotations. And you want some amount of diversity. The other thing is the genetic vulnerability. Now, monocropping does not equate with genetic vulnerability if you're deploying resistance strategically. And indeed, there are efforts to do just that, so that you don't. Some of you might remember the southern corn leaf blight. And when we found out that something in the cytoplasmic male sterile parent conferred a susceptibility to a race that went right through a whole range of germplasm in the U.S. Corn Belt. And that was a vulnerability, and people learned from that. So, you know, crop systems, intercropping and such, we're not pro or anti them based on any particular, I mean, this is all, I think my approach on this is that farmer choice should decide, but hopefully an informed choice so that vulnerability is something that's taken into that calculation. And plant breeders, of course, have to be cognizant of it. The other thing I'd say is, despite the, quote, uniformity that we talk about sometimes with respect to modern varieties, in fact, breeders have been busy pyramiding in all kinds of resistances and, horizontal as well as vertical to get so that a grower is actually benefiting from way more genetic diversity than he or she might be able to have just growing a more traditional variety. So, it's an ongoing process, but I don't think monocropping per se is that alone isn't unsustainable, but you do have to have rotations. I mean, you're not going to grow weed after weed after weed after. I mean, that's, pathogens, soil exhaustion. So, seeing legumes, seeing cover crops, seeing, some different things, oil seeds, I think this is all to the good, but I'm not aware of anything that really says that it's somehow an assault on biodiversity or something. I suppose the comment you could make is, to what extent are there refugia for various kinds of insects, maybe that don't attack that crop or don't attack it, don't eat it, and to what extent are there places along ditches, along roads, et cetera, where there's a larger variety of species and pollinators. And so, I mean, I think there probably are some legitimate researchable issues, and I think there are people working on those. By and large, most of the places we work, this isn't a problem because you don't tend to have large-scale, extensive land holdings. You get much more of a patchwork, and it's, trees are integrated here or there, copses, it's so, perhaps there's some situational issues here, but there are people, of course, who think more about this. And I mean, look at the people interested in perennial cropping. I mean, that's kind of interesting too for a whole range of reasons. And that would be the same crop there, over multiple years.
So let's get back to Frederica. Frederica, you want to ask another question?
Mute. Yes, my follow-on questions was in terms of genetic editing and engineering. Has anybody pursuing a project where they can generate a plant-based egg where they can, in a sense, genetically endow all the nutrients that are in an egg, like phosphorus is another one. I mean, is that certainly zinc and iron you mentioned, and there are a few others.
So Nina or somebody else might want to come in on this one, but what I would say is, I remember that in the earlier days, 30 years ago and more, where there were people trying to work on casein proteins and getting those into plants. I never went all that far, and there are issues when you do transboundary things. Sometimes you get into allergenicity issues, some cultural concerns that some people might have for any kind of reason. We do see more resistance to transgenic animals, although we know some have just been approved, and I don't know that there's any scientific validity to those concerns. But I haven't. There certainly has been a lot of effort to put multiple nutrients into one crop. To get really animal quality protein into a crop, you're talking about a really high need for nitrogen. It's not clear to me that, I mean, one of the reasons animal source foods are so important for children is that, and women too, for many cases, is because they can be such dense concentrations of nutrients, way denser that you find in the plant world.
Right, like vitamin D and so on.
Many things, yeah, but also just, yeah, and protein and digestibility, you know, the cell walls, you don't have the cellulose. It's just a whole different kind of system. I bet there's somebody else on here who could probably offer something more than I can on that one.
Anyway, it's a thought, and I don't know if
Well,
we can find a project like that or make it a challenge.
But people, you know,
challenge.
There have been people who have tried to design proteins. There's also people who have tried to transfer whole proteins, you know, to increase the quality. Of course, you're all familiar with the fatty acid profile. A lot of work on that, and high oleic soybeans, like, you know, to get a nutritional outcome, not the one you're talking about. But there were people in the early days working on that. I just don't hear about it as much anymore.
Okay. And my other question was a little bit in a different dimension, and it was, in a sense, enticing farmers to cultivate such crops by targeted loans, microloans, and things like that. Are these thought USAID kind of coordinates such things with economic aspects, or who would do that?
I think what we tend to think about is certainly viable seed systems that deliver improved crops of any type, improved genetics to farmers, especially smallholder farmers. There's certainly issues around undercapitalization of smallholder systems in much of the world, you know, lack of mechanization, lack of irrigation, lack of storage, just not enough capital, and a lot of limitations. So those kinds of things, I mean, we see very ingenious approaches in service provision, where maybe a young person with a little capital does land preparation from here to here to here, you know, or a whole village aggregates so that it can get a higher price from a more competition from either input or output supplier markets. I don't know that we've ever tried to marry anything more than information about things like refugia. It's possible that in the Bangladesh eggplant story that there might have been some training and such that the Bangladesh Agricultural Research Institute provided. I believe that's probably the case. But we haven't gone so far as to actually, you know, have a package that includes finance. But there are people out there doing that. Maybe you've heard of the 1 Acre Fund. That's a terrific, now that's not about a specific technology, but it is about trying to really put the pieces together, including some of the credit, which is often in such short supply, and which the commercial banking sector feels is too high a risk profile for them.
Let's move on to
Thank you.
questions.
Pleasure.
I have a question here. They're kind of related ones. Want to know about the faith-based organizations such as Catholic Relief Services and Lutheran World Relief that do a lot of work in less developed countries. Have they supported GMOs, have been neutral, or have they opposed them, to your knowledge?
I would say that in most cases, the key partners for us, like CRS in many settings, especially challenging ones, they probably wouldn't be the places where we'd be trying to introduce a transgenic one. Now that might change, let's say, if a country approved BT maize to preserve the maize crop from fall armyworm attack, then we might well be talking to them. Although even there, it's more of a hybrid seed, private seed system approach. But I think the Catholic Church has been mostly positive, although there are certain clerics in certain places that have been outspoken the other direction. I don't know as much about the position of the Lutherans. And I mean, but I think generally speaking, most American faith-based and non-faith-based groups, you know, there's Bread for the World, but there's also the Alliance to End Hunger, which is more secular organizations. They're all pretty pro-technology, I think. I could be wrong, maybe on a few. Occasionally, you know, they get dragged into something that probably we wouldn't be excited about, what the organizers were trying to do. But generally speaking, I think they are interested in solutions. And like us, they support the idea of farmer choice.
So that leads us to follow up on something you mentioned, which is what organizations were opposed to introducing fortified crops in Bangladesh?
Oh, well, it's really, in Bangladesh, it's, it was sort of some in the press, and probably there were some activists. In India, of course, is where it's a really big deal. And of course, you have Greenpeace and you have a range of others. Oh goodness, there's Earth Defense, or there's a number of them out there. And there's some other activists that are very prominent, and it's almost like a vocation and a business to be in this space. I mean, in Bangladesh, the other thing in India, just to recall, when BT cotton first came in, remember, it came in adventitiously. People brought it in before they approved it. But the pesticide industry lobbied very hard behind the scenes. At least that's what I've always heard. I don't know that I've seen that in writing, but I've heard that, they were not happy about losing huge markets for cotton pesticides for bollworms. There certainly are, it's often in the press. We do a lot of outreach. When I was in Bangladesh, I met with all kinds of press outlets to answer questions. We try to really be open and engaging, but there are certainly many organizations, many of the kind of advocacy groups. It's really not, it doesn't tend to be the farmer organizations. It tends to be the advocacy groups that are more outspoken, the ones that attack the rice fields in the Philippines and so forth, via campesinos. I usually don't start mentioning names because, I'm not looking to get into a face-off.
Yeah, I was trying to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I know.
So David Rabinowitz has a question. David, do you want to ask your question directly? I'll read it for him. He wants to know if unpolished golden rice, that is brown golden rice, has any advantage over polished golden rice. And then would it be worth promoting those advantages?
Well, it's, what happens when you mill rice, you have the brown rice, which does include some additional nutrients in it. I think thiamine in particular, maybe, as I recall. But it's also got fats, and they're very unstable in tropical temperatures. So people just don't think of eating brown rice in tropical climes because of that rancidity issue. And so I don't know that we would promote that. The other issue is that, and I don't know exactly the details on brown rice, I like it, but there are some issues sometimes with what's called phytate and other complex acids that can tie up nutrients, especially, I think, phosphates and such, phosphorus. So, it would be a good question to ask, and it might be in certain settings that would be something that, a niche market, particularly in a place where people could keep the rice cool, so they could keep it a bit longer, would be. The other piece, though, I think, is the golden rice. It's the sensory, the color. I wonder what it would look like if it was, just still brown. It'd be an interesting, how distinctive it would be from other brown rice.
So I have one last question. Are you this is from Laura Terracerio. I apologize for not getting your name right. Are you focused on modifying specific grains and vegetables because of their longevity post-harvest, or more so the popularity of the plant in the area of focus?
Yeah, if it were me, again, we usually follow the lead of our partners. in the countries we're working in, you know, our interest would be, and we do cost benefit analyses on all these things. And you know, so being widely grown or widely consumed, especially by vulnerable populations, is the biggest opportunity there. We haven't really gotten into quality traits like shelf stability, and you know, so I guess there's some of that in the private sector, perhaps, the tomato being the famous example. But you know, for us, it would really be, we'd be following the lead, but hopefully it would be one where, like in the case of eggplant, it is the biggest vegetable in South Asia. People eat more eggplant than any other vegetable, and it's nutritious, which I never knew. I like it, but I didn't know that it was particularly good for you.
Well, Rob, thank you a ton for giving this talk and for all the work that you do, saving lives and improving people's well-being. Can't thank you enough. I think we all support your efforts, and we greatly appreciate your coming here and giving this talk.
Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure, and I'm really happy to be part of the group now. I just by hearing the questions and all the thoughtfulness and interest that people have, and hearing about the cosmos as I was waiting in the green room, so to speak, is exciting. So it was a great pleasure, and I look forward to getting better acquainted over time.
That will be great. And you do have a rain check for the reception and dinner that we couldn't attend because of COVID-19. And
Thank you.
sometime in the future, when things get back to normal, we certainly hope you will come and attend one of the events. And
I'll do my best. If you know, if somebody has any burning questions they want to follow up on, please, Larry, you can share my email, and I'm happy to try to do whatever I can to connect them to people who might be better at answering them than I.
That's very generous, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Have a great night. Happy weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thank everyone for joining us. The recording of tonight's lecture will be available to everyone on the PSW YouTube channel and in due course on Vimeo and via the PSW website. Please share the link with your friends and subscribe to the channel for notifications on new postings. Before you go, we have a few important notes. The 2,430th meeting in the next lecture will be in 2 weeks on Friday, December 4th, 2020. The speaker will be Christoph Waldman. His lecture will be on the German Triple Project to explore Europa's oceans beneath its icy surface. And the rest of the fall lectures series has been posted to the website. Check there often for updates. Let's also thank tonight's crew, James, Cameo, and Robin, for producing tonight's event. And I will now adjourn the 2,429th meeting of the Society. I wish everyone a good evening. The meeting is adjourned.